Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have The General Grant Gets Lost in the Aucklands?
Here we are. Enjoy!
It seemed as though all of nature had conspired for the destruction of the General Grant. First had come the fog that had lasted for several days, preventing the captain from taking an accurate bearing. Then, when the fog had lifted, they found that they had drawn far closer to the Auckland Islands than was ever advisable. Worse yet, now the wind had died, making it impossible for them to steer the ship to safety. The sea, growing rough, carried them closer and closer to shore. And since they had not expected to be close to land for some time, their cables and anchors were stowed deep in the hold and out of reach. There was no way to stop themselves as they drew closer and closer to the rocks. The ship, with 83 people on board, was entirely at the mercy of where the waves took her. First, she was drawn into a cove, but unfortunately, the coast here was rocks and cliffs, not sandy beaches. The first time the ship struck the rocks, she lost her fore-boom staysail, and then she was carried by the waves stern first, where a projecting rock took away her mizzenguy and rudder. The impact was enough to break the ribs of the man who had been at the ship's wheel, trying desperately to steer her to safety. Now, without any means of control at all, and with the pitch of night all around them, the ship drove towards the land, being drawn by the waves into a volcanic crevice or cave. The cave was barely large enough for the ship to fit, and the mizzenmast knocked against the top of the cave with every swelling wave, and the sides of the ship scraped against the edges. Rocks, knocked loose by the mast, fell on the ship, crushing her forecastle. Still, in the pitch black of the night, and inside of the cave, there was nothing that anyone could do but wait tensely for morning. They knew that their ship was doomed, but they had little hope of safely launching the boats without the help of daylight. Instead, the crew and passengers alike huddled in the cabin for shelter against the rocks falling from above them. As dawn broke, it was clear that the ship was not going to last long, and there was going to need to be an evacuation. As the mast had knocked against the roof of the cave, it had been driven through the bottom of the ship. The impaled ship was now clearly sinking. Launching boats in such a small space, with waves pounding into the rocks all around them, was no small task, however. The first boat that was launched was intended to seek out a safe landing that it could lead the rest of the passengers and crew to. It failed to find one, however, and therefore did not return to the ship, thinking it was not worth the risk. Instead, it waited at the mouth of the cave, waiting for everyone else to join them, so that they could determine what to do next. This was later attributed to a misunderstanding about what their orders had been. Half an hour later, the first officer of the ship, Mr. Crown, launched the second boat. This one was intended for the use of all of the women and children who were on board. Out of consideration of a possible length of time as castaways, food provisions were loaded on her as well. Things did not go smoothly, however. Mrs. Jewell, whose position on the ship was complicated, had a rough time in her transfer to the boat, but she was also the only woman to survive the wreck. She had paid for her passage as a passenger, but since she was the wife of one of the common seamen, she had been forced to sign articles as a stewardess for the ship as well. She would later testify that though she was officially the stewardess, no one did the duties of the stewardess on the ship, and it was simply a formality to gain her passage. Perhaps it was a test to see if the method was safe that they lowered a woman who was formerly a member of the crew, or maybe it was of consideration towards her crew member husband that she was favored to go first. The motive was not recorded. What is recorded is that now the seas grew even more rough than before, and that instead of finding herself on the boat, Mrs. Jewell found herself in the water. Considering women's fashions in the mid-1800s, the experience must have been a terrifying one. Mr. Tier, who was a passenger on this voyage, but as an experienced ship's pilot had been favored with a spot next to the first mate on the launched boat, attempted to come and rescue her. He was able to catch hold of her and keep her above water, but he found that he was not able to pull her onto the boat. Seeing this, her husband jumped into the water, and between Mr. Jewel and Mr. Tier, Mrs. Jewel soon was safely on the boat. Seeing Mr. Jewel successfully gain the boat after jumping ship, Mr. Cowley and Mr. Allen, both passengers, also jumped in the water and made it onto the boat. Though there had been an intention to save more people, the seas were growing more and more rough, and a retreat to lighten the load seemed prudent. They therefore started to make their way towards the first boat that had been launched in order to transfer some of their passengers onto her outside of the dangerous cave. In the meantime, the longboat was being filled, and when it had about 40 people on board, it was washed over the side of the ship. The longboat started to pull away from the ship, but the waves inside of the cave were very dangerous now, and the longboat was quickly swamped and sunk. The second boat in command of the first mate now tried to get as close as they were able to the longboat while not being swamped themselves, but only 3 men were able to swim to get on board of them. Mr. Ashworth, a passenger, and Mr. Sangwilly and Mr. Heyman, both members of the crew, were able to scramble on board. The men on the boat watched with horror as everyone else sank beneath the waves. This included Captain Lachlan, who had refused to leave his ship. The last that was seen of him was him standing on the stump of the mast of the sinking ship, waving his handkerchief in farewell to the men who were doing their best to survive. In total, there were now only 15 survivors out of her original count of 83 people on board. The trials of the survivors had only just begun, however. The waves that had swamped the longboat had not ceased, and though they were not immediately deadly to the ships once they were out of the cave, they did mean that the men found themselves constantly bailing as they desperately tried to make it to Disappointment Island, where they hoped they would finally find a safe beach to land on. The wind was so strong, however, that they were not able to make even such a short journey in a day, and they spent a miserable and wet night in the open boats. The next morning they found a safe shelter on Disappointment Island, but when trying to land, the boat with the food on it capsized, and they were able to save only a very small portion of it. They were able to save the boat, however, and land it, which was to prove important. Disappointment Island lived up to its name. They were able to find water on it, for which they were grateful since they had had none since they left the General Grant. But there was no food, and so they determined that they were going to have to continue their journey. They spent a night on the northern end of the main island, but still not considering it a suitable place to settle, they finally reached Port Ross. This had been the home of the Enderby settlement, a failed attempt at a whaling colony independent of Australia or New Zealand by Charles Enderby. This was where the survivors of the General Grant decided their best chance of survival would be. They had a single match with which they managed to light a fire, and this they took constant care of, never allowing it to go out. With a fire, they were able to cook their first meal in 3 days, and for the first time since the General Grant found its way into the cave, it seemed as though they were finally out of immediate danger. They still had several cans of boiled meat, but these they set aside in case of sickness, and they set about to determine how they were going to live off of the land. The Auckland Islands were full of signs where people had once lived. Not only was there a failed Enderby settlement, but with a lot of determination, they were also eventually able to find Musgrave's hut. Musgrave and his men had been shipwrecked only a few years before, and they had all survived. Their story had been well told in the press at the time, and the survivors of the General Grant imagined that the remains of his hut would surely have everything that they would need to survive also. The Enderby settlement was proving to be a disappointment, though at least they had been able to move into one of the huts that the settlers had left behind. After a long search, some of the men from the General Grant were indeed able to find the Musgrave hut, but this too was a disappointment. It was true that Musgrave and his men had been able to survive, but their life on the Auckland Islands had not been an easy one, and they had left nothing much of use to aid in the survival of anyone who came after. The main thing that they had left was another place to stay, and now the group split up frequently between the Enderby settlement and Musgrave's hut, mainly to spread out hunting and lessen the burden on resources in one spot. Just as the people who had come before them, The survivors of the General Grant wreck found that their diet mainly included seal meat and limpets. The Aucklands had goats that had been dropped off in an attempt to make it a more hospitable place, as well as rabbits, but with no means to capture either, they were ignored as a food source initially. It was only as they started to settle into their new way of life that they found ways to hunt both of these animals, adding some variety to their diet. They also managed to find some eggs and catch fish. While there was still some concern about a lack of variety in their diet, they were comforted in the knowledge they were not going to immediately starve to death. The General Grant had been wrecked in May of 1866, but it was not until October that they spotted a ship. Though they did everything to attract her attention, including trying to chase her down in their small boat, she either failed to notice them or failed to stop. They were very depressed after this, but also more accepting of the idea that this was going to be a long stay. The group that had been at Musgrave's hut now returned to stay in the Enderby hut again, and the united group set about to be as comfortable as possible. Many of the survivors had left the General Grant without shoes or coats, and those that had been fully dressed still found that their clothing was growing worn and damaged. In the harsh Auckland Islands, this was not going to do. They fashioned needles out of bones of an albatross, and set about turning the skins of the seals that they had hunted into warm and weatherproof leather clothing. By the end of their stay on the island, they all had articles of clothing made of sealskin, and Mrs. Jewell had been made an entire suit made of the leather that had been much more suitable for the environment than what she had come ashore in. Having given up on the idea of a rescue, that January they fitted up one of the boats for a long voyage, and 5 of the men, including First Mate Crown, set out to try to find New Zealand. They built a small stove for the boat, an awning made of sealskin, and stocked it with water and food stored in the stomachs of seals. The first night after the launch, however, the weather shifted again, and it stormed heavily. The boat was also lacking in any navigational instruments, and while they thought that New Zealand was to the east, it was actually to the northwest. After 5 weeks passed, the people on the island were forced to admit that the boat was probably not coming back, and in all likelihood had not survived. This left them with the task of preparing for a winter on the island. The entire group abandoned Enderby, though it was the best place to spot passing ships, and instead relocated to Musgrave's old hut with survival in mind. Here, there was an old boiler that had been salvaged by the survivors under Musgrave from their wrecked ship, the Grafton. They used this to boil seawater to collect salt, and then use it to preserve seal meat, something that would keep them alive through the winter, which was very harsh and almost impossible to go places during. It was in the height of this harsh winter in September that the only member of the survivors to die on the island passed away. Despite all of the hardships, Mr. McClelland, age 62, passed away of natural causes, and was buried by the other survivors, who took his death hard. Still, there was no choice but to continue with their hard work of surviving. There was very little time to mourn. Even while grieving, the survivors set about finding small bits of flax growing wild that they were able to spin into thread, and scavenging potatoes that were left in the remains of the gardens in the Enderby settlement. They were also able to capture some young pigs that they found. Soon, they not only had a garden, but also pig pens to help with their continued life on the island. The survivors had not given up on the idea of a rescue. They inflated the bladders of pigs and tied messages written on wood boards to them, and then sent them out to sea. They also built small wooden boats that they carved where they were and pleased for help before pushing them into the ocean. They also attached papers to trees on the islands telling of their plight, and the wreck of their ship in the hopes that even if they were not seen, a ship stopping for water or meat on the islands might see them. Though it was only November when the survivors of the General Grant were already getting prepared for another harsh winter by salting meat, when they spied a cutter coming towards the islands. They frantically tried to motion to her, but she did not seem to see them, and she continued, causing them despair. Only 2 days later, they saw a brig, the Amherst, and not willing to risk being passed on again, they jumped into the remaining boat and managed to row out to her. When the survivors climbed on board and told of their 18 months ordeal, they were treated better than any of them expected. Not only that, but as they went past Carnley Harbor on their way to civilization, they found the cutter had passed them before. It turned out that when the captain had landed his casks on shore for water, he had found the papers that they had posted asking for help, and he was just on his way to look for them himself. Their attempts to be found had been far less useless than they had felt only a few days before. Though the tales of survival were what captured the public imagination at first, what stayed in the public mind was a prospect of treasure. The General Grant was still a very new ship when she sank. She had been built in 1864 and had been launched from the Bath shipyards in Maine. The 1,183-ton, 3-masted bark had been loaded with all sorts of treasures when she had left Australia, and as the new ship with a reliable reputation, she had attracted what Australia had to offer, which included the findings from the Australian goldfields. It was soon known that her cargo had been 2,057 bales of wool, 136 packages of leather, 9 tons of zinc spelter, 753 calfskins, 10,446 horns, and the item that captured the public imagination, 2,756 ounces of gold. It did not take long for people to try to make their way to the Auckland Islands in the hopes of finding the wreck and enriching themselves. It was a more difficult prospect than expected because the people who had survived the wreck were not certain where it was either, and mainly could say that it was about 6 miles from Disappointment Island. At no time during their stay on the island had they ventured back to the site of the wreck. It was considered too dangerous of a prospect, with very little chance of reward as far as goods for their immediate survival. Mr. Ashworth did venture back about 3 years later, fired with the idea of finding the lost treasures of the ship. Their fears of the past about looking for it being too dangerous proved to be founded, however. While he was part of an expedition searching for the wreck, Mr. Ashworth was drowned. The other survivors stayed clear of the Auckland Islands. The Jewels found that there was safer money in touring around in the clothing they had made of sealskin and telling their story of their survival than there was in treasure hunting. To this day, the General Grant stirs the imagination. The idea of a shipwreck in a cave is unusual as it is, but one filled with gold, still waiting to be discovered, is something that attracts people to look for it. So far, they have been unsuccessful. Diver Bill Day has been looking for the past 35 years, but has announced that this year is going to be his last attempt. If he does not find it this year, it will be up to someone else, maybe in the distant future, to discover the ill-fated ship with all of her treasures. For the story of the incredible survival of the men under Musgrave, please see Island of the Lost by Joan Druitt. And for more information about the General Grant, please see the sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.